Hi, everybody. Welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is offered in conjunction with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we read and study every single book of the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. If you'd like more information about that, you can find it on my website at www.kimberlyconstantministries.com. And there's information and a registration form if you'd like to sign up for our weekly newsletter and or the weekly discussion groups we have over Zoom. But you can also just follow along with the podcast. I'm happy to have you here in whatever capacity. And if you've been following in real time, we've had a bit of a break for the Christmas and New Year holiday. And so I'm back with you with a cold, so I apologize for my voice in advance. And also, I apologize for the echo. If you know me, you know that we've been adding on to our house. We've been undergoing a huge remodel, new addition project. And I finally have an office, but I definitely need a rug because I can hear the echoing happening in here. But I'm just super excited because I was recording these in my closet. So now I'm in a proper room with a window and a view, and it's glorious. It's just echoey. So apologies about that. But thank you so much for being here. And we are picking up with today's lecture, setting the scene for Jeremiah and Lamentations. So let's dive in. So if you follow along with the Bible study or you're part of that study, I set the scene so that they can then do their weekly readings. So I have weekly readings that you go through for each book or segment of the Bible that we're studying. And then this allows people to kind of get their grounding before they begin their reading process. So that's why these are called setting the scene. And if we look at our timeline, we are in the books of the prophets, the major prophets here with Jeremiah. And it's covering the same period of history that we looked at in the historical books. And the prophets are not necessarily in chronological order, so we kind of bounce around in this part of the Bible. But this map, if you're able to see the PowerPoint presentation, PDF that's associated with this lecture, I have a map of the biblical timeline, and it shows you where Jeremiah is here. So just kind of following on the heels of Isaiah, and he's going to be prophesying to the southern kingdom of Judah all the way up to and after, a little bit after the exile. So that's where we are in history. So in terms of authorship for the book of Jeremiah, most people believe Jeremiah wrote it, or at least portions of it. As we know, this is standard for the Bible. Often lots of people contribute to one book, including editors that come along later and put this material into place. So Jeremiah definitely wrote portions, and then his scribe Baruch probably helped him and wrote additional material. We date this sometime just before the exile, in the early mid-500s, but there is material that talks about after exile, and that was probably added later by Baruch, who would have known the rest of the story. Interesting tidbit here for those interested in this kind of thing. There's a significant difference in the length of the book of Jeremiah depending on which ancient version you are reading. So the ancient Hebrew version is longer than the ancient Greek version. So I talked about this a long time ago, back in the first lecture, intro to this podcast series, I believe. But there's a Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. And it is the Hebrew Bible just taken and translated into Greek. But there's a few differences. And we're going to talk more about that in a couple of weeks when we look at in between the Testaments. But it's just interesting. The Greek is shorter and the Greek version is organized differently. Scholars believe this is because the Septuagint was translated from an incomplete Hebrew copy, and then later we discovered better copies of the Hebrew book of Jeremiah. So just some interesting, very biblical, scholarly information there for you. Then we have the book of Lamentations, and the reason we're putting these together in our study is because both are believed to have been authored by Jeremiah. There's universal support that claims Jeremiah authored Lamentations, both from ancient Jewish tradition as well as the early church fathers. And this dating is probably shortly after exile, somewhere between 586 to to 530 BC, and that's because the nature of it is mourning over the fact that they are in exile. So it's probably the last thing that Jeremiah wrote before he died. So the genre, in terms of the book of Jeremiah, there are many. There's poetry, there's judgment speeches, oracles, salvation speeches, there's prose, kind of sermon-like material. There's some autobiographical narrative in here. There's biographical narrative, historiography, and rhetoric. So pretty much everything that you can find in the Old Testament. And it's organized by theme and literary style. So Jeremiah is not chronological. That's pretty typical of the prophetic books. It makes it hard to read sometimes because we're jumping all over the place. But the genres definitely stand out because it's sort of organized along those lines. And then Lamentations takes us back to wisdom literature. But again, I didn't include this with wisdom literature. And in our Bible, it follows Jeremiah because it is attributed to him. It's kind of like the last thing that he wrote, like an addendum almost to his book. And the Hebrew title for Lamentations is How, and that is the word that would begin a typical lament. We talked a lot about laments when we looked at Psalms, so this is going to be familiar to you when we get to it. So again, another genre here included with Jeremiah. So if we look at the structure of Jeremiah, I have here, if you're able to see the presentation, a slide by Philip Kaiser, who did a wonderful job of identifying what's called a chiastic structure. So this is where you can see a pattern to the material. It starts, A, B, C, D, and then you hit the pinnacle, and then it goes D, C, A, B in the backwards order. It's hard to explain just listening. So if you don't have access to the PDF, Google chiastic structure, Google structure of Jeremiah, Philip Kaiser, Kayser, and look at this diagram that he has. So it begins with Jeremiah's call from God to destroy and to plant. So we'll talk about that when we dive into the book of Jeremiah. And then we've got oracles against Judah. He talks about Judah's exile and suffering. He talks about judgments against specific people within Judah, certain kings and certain groups. Then he talks about the return from captivity, then Israel dwelling in the land once more, and the future restoration of individuals, all leading to the climactic moment, which is the discussion of the new covenant. And then we work backwards from there. So we kind of go back in our chiastic structure. So we have future restoration of the nation, Israel dwelling in the land again, Israel returning from captivity again. So you can see how we're like backing out. So we came down one way, we're backing out the other way. Judgments against specific kings and groups, Judah suffering and exile accomplished, oracles against the nation again, and then an epilogue, which is the fulfillment of Jeremiah's call. So again, if you can Google this, it's very helpful to look at it and see it for yourself. And then the structure of Lamentations, it's just 5 short chapters. 3 of them are what we call dirges. A dirge was used to highlight a tragedy, particularly one that seemed impossible to reverse, just a tragedy that had kind of no hopeful resolution to it. In the middle of these dirges, there's an individual lament, which is Jeremiah's own personal response and grief concerning exile. And then it ends in chapter 5 with a prayer. And we'll talk again more about that when we look specifically at the book of Lamentations. So some things to note as you read through Jeremiah and Lamentations. If you're in the study with me, we are not going to read all of Jeremiah. It's a difficult book to read through quickly. It jumps all over the place. He's kind of wordy. So I tried to just pull out things that are of interest and that kind of highlight that important structure that we talked about. As you read, I want you to note Jeremiah's call story and his attitude towards his calling, and even where that call story pops up in his book, because it's different kind of than where we've seen it in other prophetic books. Note the persecution that Jeremiah experiences as God's prophet, and how does he respond to that. Pay close attention to chapters 29 through 31. especially 31, because that is the chapter that talks about the new covenant. And that is where all of Jeremiah is pointing us to, this incredible pinnacle moment of this new covenant that is coming for the people of God. When you read Lamentations, bear in mind that Jeremiah had already prophesied about exile, and he had prophesied that God would make a way for the people to return. So they're in exile and they're mourning, but Jeremiah also is very aware that God had promised the people that after 70 years they would be allowed to return to Israel. And so his prophecy is multi-layered, as it always is in the prophetic books. And so he has all that in mind as he's writing Lamentations. Of course, he wouldn't have fully understood the significance of some of his prophecies, especially the ones that talk about Jesus Christ, because there is messianic prophecy in Jeremiah. But all of that's in his mind as he's writing Lamentations. And so once you've read Jeremiah and then you look at Lamentations, think about how all of his knowledge shines through. How does that give Jeremiah a unique perspective on the events of exile and the sorrow that they feel over their status? All right, so with that, I'll let you get to reading, and the next lecture will be on Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah itself.